Hello YouTube. Tamriel has many interesting groups and factions, and one of these is the cult of the Ancestor Moth, a cult that gave birth to the famous Moth Priests that we see in the games. Now, today we're going over the order of the Ancestor Moth, so the order these priests belong to, what this order represents, who they are, and what they do. So, with that said, let's get into it. Alright, so before we can talk about the cult of the Ancestor Moth, we need to cover the moth that the entire cult is based on. In short, Ancestor Moths, also known as Gypsy Moths, are indigenous creatures to so-called ancestral glades across Tamriel, which mainly appear in the Jarl Mountains in Cyrodiil, but also in rare other places across Tamriel. The byproducts of these moths is called Ancestor Silk. This is a special type of silk that the Nibonese Imperials living in northern Cyrodiil traditionally used for crafting and trading. Items made with Ancestor Silk were sacred to the Nibonese in ancient times. And they collected the Ancestor Silk by harnessing the song and hymnal vocals of their ancestors through the Ancestor Moths. This special silk gathering ritual dates back to the very early Nibonese and Cyrodiilic history. Now, there are many reasons for why the Nibonese people take such a pride in revering the Ancestor Moth and using their silk. For one, wearing clothes and armor made out of ancestral silk lends them a certain sense of unity with their ancestral spirits. Furthermore, it's said that the Ancestor Moths continuously house or carry the spirits of their ancestors, an ability that supposedly grants wisdom and knowledge to the living. However, many of these ancient traditions seem to have faded in modern Nibonese society, as Cyrodiil became more cosmopolitan and the heart of empires. Now, how does the cult of the Ancestor Moth factor into all of this? Well, you see, this order, which has the god Julianos as its patron deity, was created to preserve, study and utilize the ancient magics that Ancestor Moths emit and keep the ancient customs alive in a sense. The Moth Priests venerate the ancestors, believing that the wisdom of the ancestors can sing the future into present. However, after a while of studying the Ancestor Moths, it was likely discovered that through these moths, skilled priests of the order gain the ability to read the Elder Scrolls, an act regular mortals can only dream of doing. Priests do this through the ritual of the Ancestor Moth, a ritual that requires precise preparation and immense focus. The ritual can only be performed at so-called ancestral glades that contain canticle trees which attract the Ancestor Moths. Priests use a drawing knife to cut the bark of a canticle tree. Removing the bark attracts the Ancestor Moths to the tree, and with enough moths present in the glade, the priest attempting to read the Elder Scrolls gains a second type of sight through the presence of the moths. The role of the moths in this is to serve as a conduit of ancient magic that the priest then uses to decipher the scroll. Except for higher born mortals like Tiber Septim or the Last Dragonborn, Moth Priests are the only ones who are taught to coherently interpret the harmony of the Elder Scrolls that they're reading. Although every Moth Priest is taught how to perform the ritual of the Ancestor Moth, very few ever end up performing it. You see, the ritual takes immense resilience and practice to be able to interpret and understand the harmony of the scrolls, which is why most Moth Priests never get the chance to perform it. Moreover, it can take months or even years for priests to decipher one single Elder Scroll. Naturally, magical exertion of that proportion takes a toll on the eyes of the Moth Priests, eventually rendering them blind. However, due to the gravity involved in being able to read an Elder Scroll, going blind from reading an Elder Scroll is considered a privilege and honor in the order, as that would mean that they've served their purpose to help deciphering the scrolls, which are fragments of creation which allow mortals to gain glimpses into the past, possible futures and the present. The Moth Priest's motivation for reading the Elder Scrolls vary. The cult is commonly known for helping the Emperors of Cyrodiil foresee vague interpretations of future events on Tamriel, guiding them in their rule by offering glimpses of possible futures which may help them establish policies or make decisions. The structure of the information present in an Elder Scroll is very intricate and vague, and they're quite literally fragments of time and space that change constantly. Therefore, it's likely that a Moth Priest may never fully decipher and document everything in an Elder Scroll, simply because it always changes and because it's in some cases unknowable. However, their skill in reading the Elder Scrolls and the wisdom that even small glimpses into the future can offer, or at least possible futures, has on more than one occasion helped the forces of good in Tamriel. Moth Priest Dexian Avacus's intervention in Skyrim's Dawnguard DLC, for example, is a great example of how useful their knowledge and skills can be. As for who founded the Order of the Ancestor Moth, that's not entirely clear. The best estimates that we have put the founding of the Order near the end of the First Era or perhaps beginning of the Second Era, during the time of the Reman Empire, as our records of the Order begin around this time period. But we do know that alongside gaining the ability to read the Elder Scrolls, the Moth Priests are also functioning as the Scroll Keepers of the Empire. As Scroll Keepers, the cult is tasked with making sure that the Elder Scrolls are kept safe in the Imperial Library. Keeping the Elder Scrolls safe though is not a simple task, as there are artifacts that tend to appear and just disappear on their own, and not even the cult themselves know how many Elder Scrolls they have in their possession at one given moment. Besides that, powerful entities across Tamriel always tend to want to get their hands on them, which is yet another variable that the Order has to deal with, as many would like to steal the scrolls for their glimpses into possible futures. However, without proper training, these adversaries would have very little use for many of the scrolls, something that not many seem to understand. Now, moving on, the Order has a very specific ranking system, with most ranks complementing the other ranks. And to give a short overview, the Order has Initiates, Scroll Drudges, Adepts, Abbots and Augurs. Initiates are members that usually take care of retired blind Moth Priests at the Temple of the Ancestor Moths in the Gerald Mountains, which is a sort of retreat where blind Moth Priests are taken care of after having performed their duties all their lives. Initiates also go through training for Elder Scrolls readings in hope that one day they are able to read the Elder Scrolls, although very few in the Order ever attain that ability and have the gift. Now, if an Initiate shows the promise of being able to read an Elder Scroll, they may become an Adept in the Order. Adepts are priests who have the gift to read the Elder Scrolls. Now, many of these Adepts also fulfill different roles, such as becoming Abbots who lead the Ancestor Moth monasteries, and Augurs who are priests who can naturally attract Ancestor Moths. Although those last few roles can also be performed by priests who do not get the ability for reading an Elder Scrolls, just like the rank of Scroll Drudge, which is tasked with retrieving scrolls from the Imperial Library for librarians, which is also a role that can be performed without a gift, as librarians are in charge of the library housing the Elder Scrolls and do not tend to read the scrolls themselves. As such, even members who turn out not to have the gift serve important roles in the Order, and all members can help protect the scrolls and other members, as every member of the Order also learns a specific martial art called the Way of the Peaceful Fist, which can be used to floor those who threaten older priests of the Order and try to steal the Elder Scrolls. To be honest, this martial art may not be much, but it's often enough for the priests to protect themselves and the Order's blind priests. If you want to know more about the Way of the Peaceful Fist and other martial arts on Tamriel, by the way, I recommend watching my video on Tamrielic martial arts, which is in the description of this video. Now, moving on, members can also be grouped based on how good they are able to read the Elder Scrolls, and whether or not they have the gift. There are 4 of these groups: the Knave, the Unguarded Intellect, the Meditated Understanding and the Illuminated Understanding. If a Knave tries to read an Elder Scroll, all they see are odd letters and symbols, meaning that they do not have the gift to become a proper scroll-reading Moth Priest. An Unguarded Intellect can learn from and read an Elder Scroll, but they aren't resilient enough to counter the mind-shattering effects of an Elder Scroll, rendering them blind immediately upon first reading it and sometimes damage their sanity. However, they can still learn a piece of hidden knowledge as a price for their immediate blindness. The final and last 2 groups are resilient enough to read an Elder Scroll for prolonged amounts of time. This allows them to extract more information, but their vision still fades the more they read. Through proper understanding, meditation, training and natural resilience, certain members can reach Meditated Understanding and Illuminated Understanding status. Still, there's no guarantee that an initiate may not immediately go blind, even if they devoted themselves to a decade of isolated meditation and interpretation practice, especially if they don't have the natural aptitude or the gift. Now, as I mentioned before, the vision of a scroll-reading priest may fade gradually, but what they lack in vision they eventually make up for with elevated mental fortitude and a greater understanding of how to interpret the scrolls and read their language. Although this is a completely mental understanding, as when they translate the runes and they try to read everything down, that's just futile, as it turns out that while they were reading and writing they just wrote down gibberish, which they can only understand in their mind and not if they write it down directly, so they have to interpret it themselves and translate it themselves. Since the message of an Elder Scroll cannot be fit on paper, as the only tangible message an Elder Scrolls leaves is in the spirit and the soul, which can then be interpreted but never directly told. Now, at some point in a scroll reading Moth Priest's life, the Elder Scroll that they're reading will inform the priest in some way that the next reading that they undertake shall be their last, and this last reading is what the Order usually calls the ultimate reading. Priests usually isolate themselves before this to reflect on their life and prepare for their last revelation. Permanent blindness always follows the last revelation, but a priest who survives all of this tends to gain a higher understanding of life and can describe the information revealed to him in great detail. Lastly, every priest acknowledges that the prophecies that they've seen aren't set in stone. The Order claims that the Elder Scrolls don't hold prophecies until they actually come to pass. To put it simply, the priests gain insight into theoretic events that could come to pass, although no one is sure that they're actually going to happen. If you want to know more about that and how the Elder Scrolls function, I recommend watching this video I did on why the Elder Scrolls are so important and why they aren't at the same time. I explain everything there. Now, regarding the Order's involvement throughout Tamrielic history, they are usually just screwed over by a faction or group that wants what they protect, the Elder Scrolls. Their job to protect the Scrolls puts them at the mercy of all three major factions that fought in the Alliance War in the Second Era, for example. These factions, the Daggerfall Covenant, Ebonheart Pact and the Altmerry Dominion, raided the Order, murdering their priests and taking 2 Elder Scrolls each. Future priests would later conclude that this raid had to happen because of how the Elder Scrolls influenced the choices of the aforementioned factions. Choices like that likely aligned with the prophecies in the Elder Scrolls that they managed to glimpse, although we will never actually be sure. Next up, the Order was also involved in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion's Thieves Guild questline, where the player, as the Grey Fox, steals an Elder Scroll from the Imperial Palace from the Moth Priests library. The last major event that the cult of the Ancestor Moth was loosely involved in was in the Dawnguard questline in Skyrim. The Order became involved in this because in the year 175 of the 4th Era, 26 years before the events of Skyrim and the Dawnguard questline, the Elder Scrolls disappeared from the Imperial Library, leaving the Order in complete disarray as they no longer had any scrolls to study. Upon hearing a rumor that one Elder Scroll had been found in Skyrim, the cult sends the Moth Priest, Daxian Avacus, to Skyrim. Fortunately, Daxian is a Moth Priest who has the gift to read an Elder Scroll, and he can actually help the Last Dragonborn stop the Volkihar clan, which are the enemies on that questline, or the allies, depending on your choices, by reading an Elder Scroll, either voluntary or forced, depending on which side of the conflict you chose. Now, it's safe to say that the cult of the Ancestor Moth play a minor yet important role in Tamriel's history. Their study into the Elder Scrolls and the glimpses into the future that it brings allows mortals to tap into one of the most unknown and volatile sources of power and wisdom on Tamriel. And because of that, the Order and their priests are the closest link that mortals have to understanding the intricacies of time and creation of Nirn. And their wisdom guides the Emperors of Tamriel, who hope to gain an edge by understanding the future, and as such the Order can influence the course of history in subtle, yet important ways. And that is basically all I can say about the Moth Priests of Tamriel, and I hope you liked it. And a big thanks to my friend Mr. Xith, who helped me out with researching this video. He has his own channel, by the way, if you wanna look at it, you know, link in the description. And if you like this video and if you learned something new about the Elder Scrolls lore, then consider subscribing to my channel and returning for the next lore video probably next week. Now, all that remains for me to be done is to thank my top Patreon supporters, Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Polar Rasputin, Belly Peritus, Athena Iodis, Dragonborn of Nerevar, Volcure of Argonia, King Chris, Bulge, Scrap of the Scrolls, Doji, Fenrir, Sword of Bushido, Rakai and Mr. Christmas. It's thanks to these people and all the others on screen that this channel stays alive, and for that I'm very grateful. That said, I hope to see all of you in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.